Hello and Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to yet another episode. We are on episode 4 of this audiobook of Imran Khan's autobiography, Main aur Mera Pakistan. We are on page number 28 and we are starting. If you haven't watched the previous 3 episodes, you should watch them first and then continue with this one. Make sure you like, share, subscribe this video. Let's start. When my father returned after doing his postgraduate degree at Imperial College London in 1948, he was only the second person from his hometown to have become an England returned, and almost the entire town came to greet him at the railway station. An England returned would find his social status rise dramatically, and he could have his marriage arranged to a girl well above the status of his family. Then, as even now, marriage advertisements in India often state a preference for a girl with fair or wheatish complexion. Centuries of invasions from the northwest meant that the ruling classes were often fairer than those ruled, leaving an ingrained color consciousness on the Indian psyche. An England return would automatically become a VIP in Zaman Park. When any of my older cousins came back after studying at an English university, we would bombard him with questions about life there. That knowledge alone gave them status. During their time in India, the British had embedded an inferiority complex among the natives with great care. Waiters and attendants were made to wear the clothes of Mughal army officers and the Mughal aristocracy, while the officers of the symbols of British power, the army, the police, and the civil service wore the dress of colonials. The Mughal Empire, which covered most of the subcontinent from midway through the 16th century, had begun its decline in the early 1700s. But when the British East India Company started to establish its power in the subcontinent halfway through the 16th century, the Mughal court still held sway culturally and politically over much of the northern India, whose inhabitants, whether Hindu or Muslim, regarded its splendor and culture with awe and its emperor as the embodiment of political and religious power. For half a century, many of the early colonialists upheld the customs of the court. They spoke Farsi, wore the clothing of Mughal aristocracy, gave up beef and pork, and married local women, sometimes even taking several wives. The British historian William Dalrymple had done much to chronicle the change in attitude as between the mid-18th and the mid-19th century. The British took on and defeated all their military rivals in South Asia. With the French, the Sirajuddin Daulah of Bengal, the Tipu Sultan of Mysore, the Marathas, and the Sikhs all vanquished. The British became more confident of their grip over the region, and imperial arrogance set in. Evangelical Christianity also played a major part in breeding a culture of British superiority and determination to unseat the Mughal emperor and humiliate the once great dynasty. As Dalrymple writes in The Last Mughal, no longer were Indians seen as inheritors of a body of sublime and ancient wisdom as 18th century luminaries such as Sir William Jones and Warren Hastings had once believed, but instead merely poor, benighted heathen or even licentious pagans who it was hoped were eagerly awaiting conversion. India had a decentralized system of education before the arrival of the British. Each village had its own school supported by revenues generated locally, while colleges and madrasas, religious schools of higher education, were run by educational trust or Waqf boards. Waqf is an Islamic term for an endowment for a charitable purpose. When Bengal was conquered by the East India Company in 1757, it was discovered that 34% of the land generated no taxes because it was owned by various trusts, giving free education and health care. According to a survey by G.W. Leitner in 1850, some of these madrasas were of an extremely high standard, as good as Oxford and Cambridge. Thanks to the properties owned by the trusts, they could afford to pay handsome salaries to attract high-quality teachers. Leitner also surveyed the Hoshiarpur district in East Punjab and found there was 84% literacy in the area. When the British left India, it was down to 9%. The British abolished the trust, confiscated the Waqf land endowments, centralized the education system, and set up elite English language schools. These were meant to create a class of Indians who, in the words of the 19th century administrator Lord Thomas Macaulay, would be India in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, in intellect, to render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population. Behind their backs, the British used to contemptuously call these brown sahibs baboons, later babus, the Hindi word for father, only not so in this context. The impact of the British implemented education system ran far deeper than the use of English and a love for cricket. Rather, it had been used by the British for a century to subjugate the local culture and create a ruling native elite. The British were too few to dominate India themselves and relied on the acquiescence of a layer of natives to enforce their rule, a form of collaboration which was one of the most humiliating aspects of colonialism. I went to a school very much in the English mode, HSN College, the nearest Pakistan had to Eton. Like the majority of my schoolmates, I considered myself superior to those students who went to the government run Urdu medium schools. In the English medium schools, not only were all the boys taught in English, but everyone was required to speak in English. Boys caught speaking in Urdu during school hours were fined, despite it being the official language of Pakistan. Our Muslim society, with its traditions and rituals, was left behind with our families and felt disconcertingly old fashioned. The message of our education was that you had to copy the ways of the superior colonialist to make progress in life. We were to be transformed into cheap imitations of English public school boys. Our role models naturally became Western, whether they were sportsmen, movie idols, or pop stars. Besides, we could not help but notice that the older generation was deeply impressed by the colonials and their culture, no matter how much they disliked them. It was only much later that I realized how much our education dislocated our sense of ourselves as a nation. At the time, I thought more about playing cricket on HSN's beautiful sports fields. Today, our English language schools produce Desi Americans, young kids who, though they have never been out of Pakistan, have not only perfected the American twang, but all the mannerisms, including the tilt of a baseball cap, just by watching Hollywood films. While my generation's land of milk and honey was England, today's youth from the English language schools want to get to the United States and live the American dream. When Pakistan became independent, we should have rid ourselves of these English medium schools. In other post-colonial countries, India and Malaysia, they set up one course syllabus for the whole country. In Pakistan, the governments allowed this unjust system to perpetuate, and English medium schools still import the British syllabus for students studying GCSEs and A levels. Students educated in these schools had a huge advantage over the children of the masses, since all the best jobs, especially in the prestigious civil service, went to those who spoke good English. And these brown sahibs in the ruling elite were conditioned to despise their own culture and develop a self-loathing that stemmed from an ingrained inferiority complex. To show that one was educated, a stranger would immediately throw English words into the conversation to establish his credentials. At HSN, the more anglicized a boy was, the more he was admired. We were impressed by English history, English films, English teachers, English sports, English novels, and English clothes. We laughed at someone who could not speak English properly, but it was quite cool to speak Urdu with lots of English mixed in. We wore Western clothes and would feel awkward in shalwar kameez except on ethnic occasions like Eid. When I joined the Lahore cricket team at the age of 16, I found that because I came from an English medium school, I could barely communicate with the majority of the team, as they had been to Urdu medium schools. Most of the boys would gang up and make fun of me. I felt like an outsider with this huge educational and cultural gap between us, wider even that found in the British class system. Their jokes, their humor, the films they liked, their views of the world were all different to mine. It was then that I began to realize how much resentment there was among those from Urdu schools towards those from the English ones. I also realized why, despite having the best sports facilities at HSN, its boys could never compete with those from poor schools. The latter were much tougher and had a far greater hunger to succeed. Similarly, in hockey and squash, other sports that Pakistan has excelled in internationally, all the stars came from the Urdu schools. However, I discovered that they were quick to learn that the way up the social ladder was to acquire Western mannerism. So most of the cricketers loved shopping for English clothes and learning the English language, preferably with an English accent. Some of the cricketers only started drinking alcohol, which was banned in 1977 because it was a Western and hence upper class thing to do. National dress was another marker of cultural identity sabotaged by colonialism. When I was a boy, I remember one of my uncles asking a cousin of mine who was wearing shalwar kameez why he was dressed like a servant. Another time, I overheard a friend of my mother talking about someone being an upstart because he had only recently started wearing Western clothes. It was decades later in the summer of 1988 when I was trekking with a couple of English friends in the Karakoram that I became conscious of being dressed as a foreigner while all the locals were in Pakistani clothes. It suddenly dawned upon me. Here I was, a national icon, a role model who drew crowds wherever I went, and yet I was dressed like an outsider. Years later, I was embarrassed by the Pashtun tribes on my first visit to Waziristan, who resolutely insisted on speaking to me in Pashto despite the fact I did not speak much of their language. They made a point of it to emphasize their pride in their culture. It is only in the tribal area of Pakistan where people are fiercely proud of the fact that they have never been conquered, that they feel no need to borrow from anybody else's culture. Colonialism only works if the colonizers are convinced of their superiority and the colonized of their inferiority. In contrast, the legacy of the British colonialism is still strong amongst older or retired army officers and bureaucrats. The Pakistan military and the bureaucracy being originally colonial constructs. There is an ingrained inferiority complex. I remember serving Lieutenant General saying to me, "But Imran, my dear chap, why do you insist on wearing shalwar kameez when you look so good in a suit?" I'm sure a lot of people who wear Western clothes in Pakistan would like to wear shalwar kameez, especially in the heat of the summer, but they just do not have the confidence. When I had an office in the cancer hospital I founded in memory of my mother in the early 1990s, I ran the marketing department there. I noticed that most of the regular donors were from the trader class who wore shalwar kameez and decided the hospital marketing team should also wear the Pakistani dress. A couple of months later, a member of my team asked permission to revert to Western suits as he felt that the traders and other people generally did not give him the same respect if he wore Pakistani clothes. He also felt he had less confidence wearing our national clothes when he visited businessmen's offices. This complex Western and since Musharraf's regime in the early part of the 21st century and its superficial drive for westernization, even political candidates in Pakistan, particularly in Sindh and Punjab, also felt the pressure to wear Western dress. Many candidates have their publicity photographs taken in jacket and tie because they feel Western suits make them appear more sophisticated and more educated to the voters. Retaining the language or dress of occupiers or colonizers has not been that unusual throughout history. For instance, after Sicily won independence from the Arabs in the 11th century, Arabic remained the language of the island's court for another 50 years. Yet, in Pakistan, the cultural affinities of the English-speaking elite also distanced us from culture and religion. While no one ever considered becoming a Christian, it was natural that most of us started considering Islam to be backward, just like our culture. After all, the masses were religious but poor. If any student prayed or talked about religion or had a beard, he was ridiculed as a traditional Islamic cleric or scholar or Maulvi. Our Western education also laid emphasis on science, which based everything on the premise that what could not be proved did not exist. This clashed straight away with religion, which wanted us to believe in the unseen. Moreover, since in the 1960s the youth in the West were in rebellion against the older generation and against religion, we too became affected by those attitudes. By the time I finished school, I still went for Friday and Eid prayer with my father and fasted during Ramadan, yet for me, and indeed for most of my friends, God was confined to the mosque. Our young, impressionable minds were convinced by English and American films that Western culture was superior, along with its vastly superior technology. Had we had better understanding of our cultural heritage or our religion and its history, it might have helped us to resist the lure of the West. Nor could our preachers counter this great onslaught of colonial culture, for they had no Western education and could not communicate with us in the language in which we had been taught. Our cultural separation from them reinforced in our minds the idea that Islam was backward. I can remember students laughing at preachers with poor English. Even nowadays, as the ruling elite despairs of the many young men who have turned to fundamentalist Islam, few grasp how much this great educational divide curvates our troubles. While they quite rightly talk about reforming the madrasas which have sprung up in their thousands and often offer many poor families their only access to education, they rarely look at the problem from the point of view of the masses who have little reason to feel an affinity with an elite, who remain the inheritors of colonialism, representatives of an alien foreign culture. They have nothing in common with these people and see them as a kind of Trojan horses for the West trying to destroy our culture. It is through developing world elites that a more potent and permanent invasion is taking place in many countries. Physical colonialism has been replaced by cultural colonialism. The writer Titus Burckhardt describes this kind of dislocation in the book Fez, A City of Islam. Burckhardt spent time in the Moroccan city in the 1930s. When he revisited it 25 years later, he observed, "At the time I first knew it, men who had spent their youth in an unaltered traditional world were still the heads of families. For many of them, the spirit that had once created the Mosque of Cordoba and the Alhambra was nearer and more real than all the innovations that European rule had brought with it. Since then, however, a new generation had arisen, one which from its earliest childhood must have been blinded by the glare of European might and which in large measure had attended European schools and henceforth bore within it the sting of an almost insuperable contradiction. For how could there be any reconciliation between the inherited traditional life, which despite all its frugalities carried with it the treasure of an eternal meaning, and the modern European world, which as it so palpably demonstrates is a force oriented entirely to this world, towards possessions and enjoyments, and in every way contemptuous of the sacred? These splendid men of the now dying generation, whom I had once known, had indeed been conquered outwardly, but inwardly they remained free. The younger generation, on the other hand, had gained an outward victory when Morocco gained independence some years ago, and now ran the grave risk of succumbing inwardly. The jolt came in 1971. In the elections of 1970, the Awami League of the East Pakistan, the party demanding autonomy there, had won a majority in parliament. Yet, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the leader of the Pakistan's People's Party, which had won in West Pakistan, conniving with the military dictator General Yahya, deprived the Awami League of East Pakistan of the chance to form a government. The people of East Pakistan rebelled against what they saw as their disenfranchisement by the more powerful West Pakistan. Yahya Khan, the president and the army commander-in-chief, sent in the army to suppress the dissent. The same army that had held the first free elections on an adult franchise in the first place. As the troops descended on East Pakistan, Bhutto returned to Karachi from Dhaka, triumphantly proclaiming that Pakistan had been saved. But the result was a terrible war in which thousands of civilians died and millions of refugees poured into India's West Bengal. I was with the West Pakistani under-19 cricket team on the last flight out of East Pakistan before the army went in. As we played the East Pakistan team, we could feel the hostility towards us, not just from the crowds in Dhaka Stadium, but from our sporting opponents too. The captain of the East Pakistan team, Ashraful Haq, who later became a friend of mine, told me at dinner that evening about the great antagonism felt towards West Pakistan. He told me that many like him would want to be part of Pakistan were they to be given their due rights, but as things stood, there was a strong movement for independence. I was shocked to hear this because we had no idea about the feelings of the people of East Pakistan, thanks to total media censorship in West Pakistan. However, it had never occurred to me or many others that there was a chance of the country breaking apart. West Pakistan made a series of blunders which allowed India to subsequently exploit the situation. India, then led by Nehru's daughter Indira Gandhi, invaded East Pakistan in support of the Bengali insurgency. Unlike the 1965 war with India, this time we were quickly defeated. Our army signed a humiliating surrender in Dhaka and the Indians took 90,000 prisoners of war. Our country was split in two and East Pakistan became the newly created Bangladesh. Indira Gandhi had achieved far more than her father had ever done in destroying Jinnah's idea of Pakistan. It was meant to be a homeland for the Muslims of the subcontinent. Now, after a bitter civil war and a crushing defeat which still haunts our army, it had become a homeland only for West Pakistanis. A few years later, in 1974, I met up with Ashraful Haq again. and I was shocked at the number of Bengali civilians he told me had been killed in the military action. The figures listed by the both sides are hard to verify, but it is possible that hundreds of thousands of civilians died in the civil war that lasted several months, and millions more fled into India seeking safety. I had previously argued with English and Indian contemporaries that this was all propaganda against the Pakistani army in Pakistan. After hearing Huck's side of the story, I vowed I would never accept our government's propaganda at face value or ever back a military operation against our own people. My career in cricket had just started. I played my first international match for Pakistan in England in the summer of 1971. And away from the censored newspapers and the government TV channel, I was exposed to the international media. Seeing our surrender was only made worse when the massacre attributed to us was shown. The shock was greater because the government and the military kept telling the people that they would fight to the end. Only 24 hours before the surrender, General Niazi from my tribe, the commander of the forces in East Pakistan, had defiantly given an interview on the BBC where he declared the army would fight to the last man. The surrender caused mass depression and a loss of faith in our country. Like everyone else in Pakistan, I had believed the propaganda of our state television, who had labeled the Bengali fighters as terrorists, militants, insurgents, or Indian-backed fighters. The same terminology that is used today about those fighting in Pakistan's tribal areas. And Balochistan. Then, as now, we fought the symptoms rather than addressing the root cause of the violence, our failure to address the legitimate aspirations of Pakistan's many ethnic groups. I also had the opportunity to see for myself how my country was perceived abroad. I had a rude awakening, for without the protection of my family, I suddenly felt lonely and insecure. For the first time, I had to make an effort with people and found it quite difficult. After the tour, I stayed back to finish my education at the Royal Grammar School in Worcester. I found it almost impossible to make friends with the British. My friendships with my cousins and a few school friends were informal and deep. We would drop in at each other's houses at all hours, and since we had grown up together, our bonds were strong and could withstand fighting and jealousy. Now I was faced with a situation where I did not know anyone, nor did I understand the British culture, which was very different to the joint family system in which I had grown up. The friendships that I had in England were never as meaningful as those I had in Pakistan until much later. Following the completion of my A-levels in 1972, I began my studies at Oxford. It was a huge culture shock. The youth rebellion was in full swing, and the English culture we knew through our English school masters, books, stories, and anecdotes of my parents' generation had disappeared under a blitz of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Traditional British values, which stemmed from the Victorians' ideas on morality and had so impressed the older generation in Pakistan, were being rapidly discarded in Britain itself, dismissed as hypocritical. Films and pop stars were advocating free sex, drugs, and bad manners. It was fashionable to swear, and prudishness was dismissed as boring. The biggest attack was on religion and on God. In Pakistan, the English-speaking elite considered the mullah backward, but even they never dared publicly attack him. Most of them would follow Islamic rituals and consider themselves religious. However, in Britain, religion became a source of ridicule, lampooned in Monty Python's Flying Circus and in the film The Life of Brian in the 1970s, as well as in television skits by Benny Hill portraying priests and nuns as sexual perverts. Our role models were Mick Jagger and David Bowie, while our intellectual thinking was defined by the then popular Marxist rejection of religion. From Darwin's theory of evolution to Nietzsche's proclaiming the death of God, we were encouraged to believe religion belonged to pre-logical stage of human development. Freud thought government was an illusion created by man to fulfill his own needs. Jung termed religion an alternative to neurosis. If there was any spirituality at university, it was that of the hippies. The only problem was it was usually drug-induced and included free sex. What little belief I had in God took a real beating in the atmosphere. At best, I clung to my Muslim identity, though this had little to do with submitting to the tenets of Islam. I never drank alcohol, but that was because my boyhood hero and first cousin Majid Khan, later to be captain of the national cricket team, was a teetotaler, and I wanted to emulate him. The best way to describe my faith was no acceptance, no rejection. My Islam was reduced to rituals like attending mosque, and that too only when I was in Lahore. Similarly, fasting was also something I did if at the time I happened to be home. If there was God, then he had nothing to do with my life outside the mosque. My mother, who by this time had become deeply spiritual, was alarmed at my lack of faith and would constantly ask me to read the Quran in the hope that it would guide me. Out of love for her, several times I tried to read it and each time gave up. It was only much later that I discovered why it made no sense to me. My first winter at Oxford made me miserable. The bleak, cold and wet dull days really made me miss home and the weather in Lahore. There is no climate in the world better than the winter of Punjab. Warm, sunny days and cold nights just right for sitting by log fire. I would never tell my mother I was unhappy, but nevertheless, in one of my letters, she must have sensed I was homesick. Immediately, she wrote asking me to come back. She told me I could always return to England at some other time to resume my studies, and if I did not want to study anymore, it did not matter anyway. If it was this love and support that made me grow up with such a complete sense of security. Her total belief in me gave me self-esteem, a vital characteristic for success. This was in sharp contrast to the British students who were under great pressure to find jobs after university. Most of them had already moved out of their parents' homes. For me, as for any Pakistani, the concept of moving out was completely alien. It was unthinkable for the eldest or only son to ever leave his parents' house, as his parents were his responsibility for the rest of their lives. Perhaps it is no surprise that my best friend at Oxford was an Indian, Vikram Mehta, who came from a similar family structure to mine and had, like me, been to a private English language school. At that time, Benazir Bhutto, the daughter of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, Vikram and I became good friends. Not only because we were from similar subcontinental backgrounds, but because we were taking the same subjects, politics and economics. Vikram and I would visit Benazir's lodging in Lady Margaret Hall every Sunday, where she would have an open house serving cheese and snacks all afternoon as part of her lobbying to become president of the Oxford Union. Vikram and I had little interest in the union, but we would show support for Benazir. A friend of mine who played cricket for Oxford, Dave Furston, I discovered was the flatmate of one Tony Blair, who later became Britain's Prime Minister. After leaving university, I would spend the winter in Pakistan and the summer playing professional cricket in England. In Pakistan, I kept meeting people with a strong faith in God. The common people led their lives with God, even though they did not always obey God's commands all the time. He featured prominently in their lives. They would sin, but they would know that they were doing wrong and beg for forgiveness. Often, they had a fatalistic attitude to life, whereby they accepted any disaster as the will of God. I considered this to fit in with Marx's idea of the opium of the masses. In contrast to the ubiquity of religion and the mysticism in Pakistan, the only spiritual people I remember meeting in England were Andrew Wingfield Digby, a theology student who played with me at Oxford and was later to become a vicar, and some years later, the English wicketkeeper Alan Knott. There was one incident involving Knott that struck me in particular. When we were part of a World 11 playing in Kerry Packer's World Series in Australia in 1978, the team was discussing what to do with the prize money, whether to divide it up among the 12 of us who were sitting there or also share it with the 6 others who were not present because they were playing elsewhere but were part of the squad of the 18. We all decided that we should exclude the 6, justifying it to ourselves on the grounds that only those who had performed should be rewarded. Knott was shocked by our greed and immediately condemned us, saying we were being unfair to the others. Such was his moral authority that we all felt embarrassed and meekly consented to sharing the prize money with the entire squad. While I was adjusting to life in England, my country too was changing. Despite his own contribution to the disaster in East Pakistan, Bhutto became president in 1971 and used all of his abundant charisma to restore some of our battered national pride. For the first time in our country's history, he told the masses that they mattered. Unlike the civilian and military elite with their English coldness, he was a popular and populist leader. As a young Pakistani at the time, I could not help but be proud when he made his famous speech over Kashmir to the UN Security Council in 1965, threatening to wage war for thousands years before storming out. His standing up to the West like that, just as the country was emerging from colonialism, boosted our self-esteem. Yet, Bhutto's great intellect and charisma could not translate into success for Pakistan. His misdirected nationalization choked the economy, and the feudal mindset that tolerated neither criticism nor opposition further damaged Pakistan's democracy. But perhaps the greatest disaster of Bhutto's years was the nationalization of the school system in 1972, an act which led to the departure of many qualified teachers without adequate teacher training programs being put in place beforehand. From then onwards, our state school structure declined and generations of Pakistanis have suffered because of his policy. In the end, it was apparent that Bhutto was just using the Pakistan's People's Party (PPP) to further his personal ambitions, his promise of power to the people forgotten. Oppositions to him grew, and in 1977 he was accused by political opponents of rigging the elections in the PPP's favor. Protests against the results of the elections were brutally crushed, and in the last attempt to regain the ground and shore up support against Islamic parties, Bhutto banned alcohol, nightclubs, and gambling. As protests escalated into riots, the army were called out to control the streets. Martial law was declared, and the country was to remain under it for 11 years. General Ziaul Haq overthrew Bhutto, appointed himself president in 1978, and the following year had Bhutto hanged in a jail in Rawalpindi. I was playing cricket in Sri Lanka when I heard the news and felt an incredible sense of sadness. Even though I knew he had done wrong, I did not expect him to be executed. More upheaval was to come. The year 1979 was to prove a turning point for our country. In neighboring Iran, the Shah's westernized regime was swept aside by Imam Khomeini's Islamic Revolution. Later that year, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and Pakistan became a frontline state in the Cold War. Chapter number 2. The Revolution 1979 to 1987. To tell the truth, I had no interest in politics in the 1970s or much of the 1980s. From the time I had left university in 1975 until 1983, I had been so single-mindedly and obsessively involved in international cricket that I had no time to think about much else. Anyone who has played professional sport would understand how it completely takes over one's life. One lives and breathes the sport, so intense in the competition, and hence the focus. Over the years, I came to the conclusion that genius is being obsessed with what you are doing. So I was too absorbed to worry about the consequences of Zia's military regime, his slow reversal of Bhutto's nationalization program, or the turmoil in the neighboring Iran and Afghanistan. Life continued as normal for most people. The only ones who really felt Zia's rule were his opponents. As the captain of the Pakistan cricket team, I had a good relationship with Zia. He used to call me personally when we won matches, and when in 1987 he asked me on live television to come back out of retirement for the sake of the country, I agreed. Only after his regime ended did I realize his devastating legacy, and that, like so many of the Pakistani leaders, he was motivated purely by his desire to stay in power and was oblivious to the country's decline or the long-term consequences of his policies. Amidst the steady erosion of the country's political and social fabric, the Pakistani people drew solace from its success in cricket. During the 1970s and the 1980s, our team started growing in strength to the point that we could match our former colonial masters. For teams like Pakistan, India, and the West Indies, a battle to right colonial wrongs and assert our equality was played out on the cricket field every time we took on England. My friends and two of my greatest opponents on the cricket field, Sir Vivian Richards from the West Indies and Sunil Gavaskar from India, were both examples of sportsmen who wanted to assert their equality on the cricket field against their former colonial masters. I knew that the motivation of the great teams produced by the West Indies in the 1970s and the 1980s was to beat the English. For Viv in particular, it was about self-esteem and self-respect, the two things that colonialism deprives the colonized of. Sport was not the only way to demonstrate post-colonial independence. I little realized how far the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979 would transform the Muslim world. However, it was a watershed moment in the way the West would view the Muslim world. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan later that year, putting Pakistan in the front line of the Cold War, a few of us fully grasped the extent to which that too would affect the Muslim thinking. In the world in general and in Pakistan in particular, I had visited Iran in 1974 when I went to stay with a school friend from my time at the Royal Grammar School Worcester in England. Seeing the economic and cultural divide of Iranian society and women in miniskirts in the bazaars of Tehran surprised me. In today's Lahore and Karachi, I have seen a similar disparity. Rich women going to glitzy parties in Western clothes, chauffeured by men with entirely different customs and values. But at the time, I had never seen people behave in such a westernized way in a Muslim country, and was shocked by their disregard for the cultural mores of the masses. I remember the look on the faces of the stall holders in the bazaars as these women in short skirts sashayed past. The Iranian Islamic Revolution, a few years later was to draw heavily on the support of the Bazaris, who formed the backbone of a traditional devout middle class in Iran that felt threatened by the Shah's attempts to impose an alien culture upon them, and enraged by his role as a puppet of the West. In Pakistan, however, westernized people like me were when we visited our ancestral villages or went into rural areas or even the old city of Lahore, we had to respect the local customs and sensitivities. The women in our family would wear the chadar, a cloth covering the head and the shoulders, leaving only the face exposed, or the burqa, a long garment covering the whole body. Even in Lahore, my mother always covered her hair when she went shopping in the bazaar. To this day, most women in Pakistan wear the traditional shalwar kameez with the patta headscarf. Only when recently have younger urban women started to wear jeans. The Iranian Revolution was a reaction in part to rapid Westernization and secularization campaigns in Iran by Raza Shah, the ruler of Iran from 1925 until he was forced to abdicate by the Allied powers in 1941. And then his son Muhammad Raza Shah Pahlavi. The latter was a brutal autocrat seen to be beholden to the United States after he was restored to power, following a 1953 CIA-backed up coup to overthrow nationalist Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh had the temerity to stand up for the rights of the Iranian people and seize the country's oil production, which had hitherto to been controlled by the British government's Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Muhammad Raza Shah's sweeping social and economic changes alienated the poor, the religious, and the traditional merchant class who grew resentful of an elite enriched by the 1970s oil boom. Meanwhile, there was a growing class of rural poor who had moved to the cities in the hope of benefiting from the petrodollar fueled economic growth but found themselves unemployed, consigned to the slums and increasingly under pressure from inflation as the economy overheated. The revolution led by the Khomeini promised to return power to the people and restore religious purity to Iran. The events of 1979 in Tehran and the establishment of an Islamic State highlighted to the world the revolutionary potential of Islam and its power to threaten the established order in the Muslim world. The overthrow of a tyrant was welcomed jubilantly by ordinary people in Islamic countries, most of whom were also suffering under the anti-democratic rulers of leaders they viewed as Western stooges, disconnected from the economic realities and religious faith of their people. As with the Middle East revolts in 2011, a sense of euphoria rippled across the region. The broad base and the strength of movement that had toppled such a powerful US-backed regime was also inspiring to people long resentful of colonial interference and the Western hegemony. And it had been achieved through relatively peaceful means with mass demonstrations and strikes. In Pakistan, there was tremendous excitement, and I could sense this when I returned from playing cricket in England in the summer months. Since independence, we had already been governed by 4 different constitutions. We had run through parliamentary democracy, Ayub Khan's presidential democracy, which was effectively a military dictatorship, economic liberalization, and martial law. Yet here was Khomeini standing up to the West with a new system that was both Islamic and anti-imperialist. The political Islam of the Iranian Revolution filled the void left by the failure of Arab nationalism in the Muslim world. Socialism had been discredited and the communism had never really taken off in a culture where religious faith is such an intrinsic part of life. As the Iranian slogan went, neither east nor west, Khomeini had forged a new path that owed little to either the Western powers or the communist Russia, and he explicitly presented his ideology as an exportable political solution to the entire Islamic world. Consequently, the West was terrified by the Muslim world had reached a new turning point. At stake were Western puppet regimes in oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia, whose royal family Khomeini openly criticized in the same way that the West had turned a blind eye to corrupt regimes that claimed to safeguard the free world from the evils of communism. From then on, autocratic rulers could manipulate Western fears in order to clamp down on any political opposition in the name of fighting Islam fundamentalism. The 9/11 attacks on the United States further reinforced this tendency. It was also at this point that the West started sending NGOs into Muslim countries to encourage secularization, often in the name of liberating our women or promoting human rights. Whenever there is unrest in an Islamic country, the old fears about Iranization or Islamization of the country in question are raised by the West. Only recently, in the early 2011, this happened when the people of Egypt and Tunisia toppled their dictators. Other countries faced internal dissent but dealt harshly within. However, in Yemen and Bahrain, the actions that in Libya would lead to NATO intervention were allowed to continue as the regimes were doomed pro-Western. Zia, keen to legitimize his unconstitutional takeover of Pakistan, felt the mood created by the Iranian Revolution and responded accordingly. His predecessor, the Oxford and Berkeley educated Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, had used religion to counter his Western secular image by pandering to the religious parties. Bhutto's 1973 constitution confirmed Pakistan's identity as an Islamic republic. The teaching of Islam was made compulsory in schools, and a council of Islamic ideology was set up to advise on Islamic legislation. He had declared the Ahmadi sect non-Muslims. His critics, though, only hardened their demands, campaigning for the introduction of more Islamic laws. Zia cashed in on the opposition to Bhutto from the religious parties, which equated secularism with anti-Islamism. He was prepared to go much further than Bhutto, pledging on coming to power in 1977 to make Pakistan an Islamic state. His version of the Nizam-e-Mustafa, the system of the Prophet, aimed to overhaul penal codes inherited from the British by bringing them in line with the Sharia law. Emboldened by events in Iran from 1979, he introduced still more reforms, Islamizing the economy and the education system. He tried to introduce interest-free banking, imposed the automatic deduction of zakat, a proportion of one's wealth which every Muslim has to contribute annually from bank accounts, and invested in madrasas. The Hudud Ordinance imposed strict punishments for crimes, including adultery and its abuse by a corrupt police, and judicial system undermined the legal status of women, especially in the lower strata of society. Zia revamped so many laws but failed to introduce true Islamic social justice. In fact, this regime actually promoted inequality and corruption. His political use of Islam was aimed more at capturing the mood of the time. Zia also enforced Islamic rituals and promoted traditional dress codes in a bid to Islamize the country. Many years later, Musharraf attempted to overhaul Pakistan and turn it into a modern, liberal, secular state by encouraging the use of English in Western dress, which he thought would westernize Pakistan. Zia's Islamization and Musharraf's enlightened moderation failed in their aims. As in such situations, people follow the latest diktats, but inwardly carry on as before. Both Zia and Musharraf failed to understand that imposing outward observances will neither instill a sense of religious faith nor propel a country into the 21st century. General Zia's Islamization program received another boost with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Practically overnight, he became a key Cold War ally of the Americans, who now forgot their qualms about backing a military dictator. Perhaps this was the origin of the saying that you need the support of the three as to lead Pakistan: Allah, the army, and America. It was another example of the US ability to pick and choose when to object to evil despots or not, while lecturing the developing world on universal importance of democracy and human rights. Fearful that the Soviets might push through Afghanistan to reach the Arabian Sea in the Gulf and choke off vital oil supplies, the CIA, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states, through Pakistan's inter-services intelligence, the ISI, funded, trained and armed thousands of militants to fight. Many of these jihadis stayed on in Pakistan after the war, unwanted by their own governments. Having created these foot soldiers to do jihad against communism, the United States and its allies hunted them down as Al-Qaeda members and jihadis a decade after the Soviet withdrawal. At the time, there was a general feeling in Pakistan that the war against Soviet occupier was just war, and people made tremendous sacrifices. With my journalist friend Harun Rashid, I met so many young men in Peshawar who had done time in Afghanistan. Guerrillas, they might be called now, but they were heroes fighting against occupation, a romantic cause that drew idealists from across the Muslim world, in the way the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War had attracted thousands of non-Spanish volunteers in the 1930s. They became rapidly disillusioned with the way the group changed at the end of the war. However, unlike Musharraf after 9/11, Zia never allowed the CIA to spread its network within Pakistan. It was the ISI who trained the militant group funded by the CIA. So guys, we are at page number 40, chapter number 3, I think. Thank you for watching. We are going to continue this in the next episode, which will be the episode number 5. Please do like, share, subscribe, and keep supporting us. Thank you for watching. Take care. Allah Hafiz.